The Central Park was Sarah Mitchell's sanctuary. She often sat on the same worn bench under the shade of tall oak trees, her face turned toward the breeze, listening to the symphony of birds and distant laughter of children. Her hand gripped the leather leash of Bud, her loyal German shepherd guide dog. Bud was more than just her companion. He was her protector, her eyes and her lifeline after the car accident that had stolen her sight 5 years ago. Despite the calm surroundings, Bud was restless. His ears twitched at every sound, his sharp eyes scanning the park as if anticipating trouble across the park. Hank McCoy leaned against his motorcycle surrounded by a small group of leather-clad bikers with his bulky frame, shaved head, and tattoos. Hank had a presence that demanded attention. He noticed Sarah sitting quietly with Bud at her side. Something about her peaceful demeanor paired with the dog's disciplined post. Yora rubbed him the wrong way, flicking his cigarette to the ground. Hank smirked. Look at that, a princess, with her perfect little dog. He sneered, stepping away from his bike as his friends chuckled behind him. Hank's heavy boots thudded against the pavement as he crossed the park, heading straight for Sarah. Bud noticed him first. The dog's ears perked up, his body stiffening as a low growl rumbled from his chest. Sarah could feel the tension in the leash and tilt her head toward the sound of the approaching footsteps. "Hey there," Hank said mockingly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Nice dog you've got. Does he do tricks? Maybe he can jump through hoops or roll over for us." Sarah tightened her grip on Bud's, leash her heartbeat. Quickening, she couldn't see the man, but she could hear the malice in his voice. "Leave us alone," she said firmly, her tone masking the fear bubbling inside her. But Hank didn't back off. Instead, he clapped his hands loudly. Trying to provoke Bud, the dog remained steady, his piercing gaze locked on Hank, though his growl deepened. "Oh, tough guy, huh?" Hank taunted, taking another step closer by. Now a few passers-by had paused to watch the unfolding scene, but no one dared to intervene. Sensing the attention, Hank decided to up the ante. He raised his foot as if to kick. Bud the shepherd's growl erupted into a deep, guttural warning, and Sarah cried out, "Don't you dare!" What Hank didn't know was that Bud wasn't just any dog before becoming Sarah's guide. Bud had been a K-9 military service dog trained for high-risk missions and capable of taking down threats far greater than this man. As Hank's foot moved closer, Bud's instincts from years of combat training surged to the surface. His muscles tensed, and his focused gaze never wavered from the aggressor. The park fell silent, the air heavy with tension, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Hank's laughter echoed across the park as he raised his foot higher, clearly enjoying the tension he was creating. "Come on, Mutt, show me what you've got." He sneered. Sarah's fingers tightened around Bud's, leash her knuckles turning white. She couldn't see the scene unfolding, but the energy in the air was electric. Threatening, Bud, however, remained perfectly still, his body rigid like a coiled spring. His growls were deeper now, warning Hank that the next move could be his last mistake. The small crowd that had gathered stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Some had their phones out, filming the altercation, while others whispered nervously, "Someone should stop him," a woman murmured. But no one stepped forward. Sarah's voice cracked with desperation as she called out again, "Leave us alone. He's not just a dog." He'll defend himself, but her warning only fueled Hank's bravado. "Defend himself," he mocked. "He's just a big lap dog. Watch this." As Hank lunged forward with his foot aimed at Bud, the German shepherd sprang into action with a speed that stunned everyone. Bud sidestepped the kick and barked a sharp, commanding sound that reverberated through the park in one fluid motion. Beau Bud planted himself between Sarah and Hank, his sharp teeth bared and his eyes locked on the man. This wasn't the behavior of an ordinary dog. It was the response of a professional, a protector trained to neutralize threats. Hank stumbled backward, caught off guard by the intensity radiating from Bud for a brief moment. Everything stood still. Sarah, clutching Bud's leash, felt the vibrations of his movement and the tension in the air. She knew something had changed, Bud. She whispered, her voice trembling. The dog didn't look back at her. His focus was entirely on Hank, ready for whatever came next. Hank, on the other hand, was no longer laughing. His confident smirk had faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. What the hell is this dog's problem? He muttered, his voice no longer mocking, but uncertain as the crowd murmured and phones captured every second a man in a park ranger uniform finally pushed through. What's going on here? He demanded, his voice firm. Hank froze his bravado, vanishing as he realized he was now the center of unwanted attention. Bud stayed in position, unmoving, his body language making it clear if Hank tried anything again, the outcome wouldn't be in his favor. Sarah exhaled shakily, feeling the tension in Bud's leash, relaxed just slightly, but she knew the danger wasn't over yet. Hank took a cautious step back, his hands raised slightly, as if to downplay his actions. Relax. I was just messing around. The dog's overreacting, he muttered, though his voice lacked the confidence it had moments before the park. Ranger, now standing between Hank and Sarah, crossed his arms, his expression stern. You call threatening a guide dog messing around? That's not just reckless, it's illegal. Sarah clung to Bud's leash, still trembling. Bud, however, remained firmly planted in front of her, his intense gaze fixed on Hank. The tension in the air was palpable, and the murmuring crowd only heightened the unease. The ranger continued, his voice steady but firm. This dog is doing his job protecting her, and by the looks of it, he's better at his job than you are at being a decent human being. Hank's smirk faded entirely. As the ranger words landed, meanwhile, Bud's growl hadn't ceased, and Sarah's hand instinctively reached down to touch his head. She whispered, "Good boy, Bud," her voice quivering but filled with gratitude. The crowd around them watched silently, some recording the scene on their phones, others murmuring in hushed tones, but then an older man stepped forward, his worn military cap catching the sunlight, and his voice cut through the whispers. "That's no ordinary dog." The man said, his tone calm but sure. His weathered face showed years of experience, and he pointed directly at Bud. "I know that stance anywhere, that's a K9. The crowd gasped, and even Hank looked taken aback. Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion as she turned toward the man. "What do you mean? He's my guide dog," she said, gripping Bud's leash tighter, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stepped closer, nodding slowly. "He might be your guide dog now, Ma, but I'd bet money he served before that. That focus, that bark its instinct, the kind only a trained military dog has." The revelation hit Sarah like a wave. She crouched beside Bud, her fingers brushing through his thick fur, as if seeing him in a new light. "Bud," she murmured, her voice trembling with awe and disbelief. She had always known Bud was exceptional, but she never imagined his past carried such weight. The man continued, his voice steady, but filled with respect. "Dogs like him are heroes. They're trained for combat zones to protect soldiers and take down threats. If he's reacting like this, it's because he sees that man as a danger." He glanced at Hank, his gaze sharp and the biker shifted uncomfortably, his confidence fading further. Hank's bravado had vanished completely. He took another step back, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The ranger stepped closer to him, his tone unyielding ignorance. "Doesn't excuse your actions. You're lucky this dog showed restraint." Bud finally relaxed slightly, but kept his eyes on Hank as if ensuring the man didn't try anything else. Sarah exhaled shakily, her heart still pounding as she processed what she had just learned. The crowd, now buzzing with awe, couldn't take their eyes off Bud. To them, he wasn't just a guide dog anymore. He was a warrior. The park ranger stared at Hank with a mix of authority and disgust. "You're done here," he barked, gesturing for the man to step away. But Hank hesitated, his gaze flickering nervously between Bud and the older man who had identified the dog's true nature. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and someone shouted, "Call the cops." Hank cursed under his breath, his tough guy act crumbling under the weight of public judgment. Bud, though slightly more relaxed, stood his ground, his eyes still locked on Hank like a sentinel prepared to act if necessary. Sarah felt as if the world around her was spinning. Bud, a military dog. Her mind replayed the older man's words, combat zones, soldiers' threats. She crouched down beside Bud, her fingers trembling as she stroked his fur. "Bud," she whispered softly, as if trying to connect with a side of him she had never known. He turned his head slightly toward her, his eyes softening for just a moment before refocusing on Hank. The unwavering loyalty in his gaze sent a wave of emotion through her. Who was this dog she had trusted with her life for years? The older man stepped forward. Again, his expression serious but kind. "Mom, you should know, dogs like him. Don't just forget their training. It's buried deep, waiting for a moment when they're needed. And today, he thought you needed him." Sarah swallowed hard, feeling tears prick her eyes. She thought back to every moment Bud had seemed unusually alert or protective. Every time his bark had stopped her in her tracks. She had always seen him as her guide, but now she realized he had been so much more, all along. Meanwhile, Hank's discomfort grew unbearable. All right, he muttered, backing away. "I didn't mean any harm. The park ranger wasn't buying it. That's not for you to decide," he snapped. "You've already done enough." Hank turned toward the exit, his shoulders hunched as the ranger followed close behind, ensuring he didn't return. The crowd began to disperse slowly, though a few stayed behind, still fixated on Sarah and Bud. The older man lingered as well, watching Bud with a look of respect that spoke volumes when the last murmurs of the crowd faded. Sarah remained on the bench, her hand resting on Bud's. "Pack, you've always been my protector," she murmured, her voice breaking slightly. "But I never knew how far you'd go for me." Bud sat beside her, calm and steady now, his eyes scanning the park, as if ensuring the danger had passed for Sarah. The park no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a place where she had discovered a truth she never expected, one that would forever change how she saw Bud and herself. That evening, Sarah sat on the edge of her small couch, staring at Bud as he rested near her feet. The day's events replayed in her mind like a whirlwind: Hank's aggression, the park ranger's intervention, and most of all, the revelation of Bud's past. She reached for her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys as she hesitated. What would she even search for? She didn't know where to start. But the words military K-9, history eventually came to mind as she read through countless articles and stories. Her understanding of Bud deepened. These dogs weren't just trained. They were soldiers. In every sense, they were taught to detect threats, protect their handlers, and remain calm under pressure. Every detail fit perfectly with how Bud had acted that day. But it also raised questions. What had he been through? Who had he served with? And why had he ended up with her? The thought of Bud risking his life in dangerous situations stirred both pride and sadness in Sarah's heart. She closed the laptop and slid to the floor. Sitting beside Bud, her fingers ran gently through his thick fur, and she spoke softly. "I've always trusted you, Bud. But now, I understand why you're so much more than I ever realized. You've been through so much. Haven't you?" Bud's ears twitched at her voice, and he leaned into her touch for the first time. Sarah felt a connection that went beyond dependence. She felt a bond forged by Bud's quiet resilience and unwavering loyalty. The next day, Sarah made a decision. She called the local veterans organization, explaining what had happened and asking if there was any way to learn more about Bud's history. The woman on the other end of the line promised to look into it. Many retired K-9s are placed in new roles like guiding or therapy. She explained, "It's a way to give them a purpose after their service." Sarah's chest tightened. Purpose. That word carried a heavy weight. Now Bud hadn't just been given to her to help her. He had been saving her in ways she couldn't even comprehend as the call ended. Sarah knelt down beside Bud again. "We'll figure it out together," she said with a small smile. Bud wagged his tail lightly, his calm demeanor radiating comfort. Whatever they discovered, she knew one thing for certain. Bud wasn't just her guide. He was her guardian, her partner, and her hero. A week had passed since the park incident, but Sarah couldn't shake the questions about Bud's past. Every quiet moment brought her back to that older man's words, "That's a K-9. He's trained for combat." Bud had always been special, but now Sarah realized just how little she knew about him. She'd grown dependent on his guidance, yet she felt she owed it to him to understand the life he had lived before they met one afternoon while preparing to take Bud for their usual walk. Her phone buzzed. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but Sarah answered quickly, her heart pounding. "Miss Mitchell, this is Karen from the Veterans Organization." A calm voice said, "I found some information about your dog." Sarah held her breath as Karen explained your dog's military ID matches a retired K-9 named Bravo. He served overseas alongside a handler sergeant, Jake Carter. They were deployed on multiple missions before Bravo retired. Hearing Bud referred to as Bravo sent a shiver through Sarah Bravo. She repeated, almost in disbelief. Karen continued. "Sergeant Carter retired a few years ago, and now lives in Montana. If you'd like, I can provide his contact information. He may be able to tell you more about Bravo service." Sarah jotted down the details, her hands trembling when the call ended. She looked at Bud, lying at her feet, calm and watchful. Bravo. She whispered the name felt heavy, loaded with a history she couldn't begin to imagine that evening. Sarah sat on her couch, staring at her phone. She had rehearsed what to say to Sergeant Carter over and over. But anxiety kept her from dialing. What if reaching out to him reopened painful memories? What if he didn't want to talk about Bravo? But then Sarah looked at Bud, who had been her steadfast protector for years. She owed it to him to uncover the pieces of his story. Summoning her courage, she pressed the call button. The line rang twice before a deep, growly voice answered. "Hello?" The sound of it made Sarah's nerves spike, but she steadied herself. "Hi, is this Sergeant Jake Carter? My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I think I have your former K-9 Bravo." There was a long pause, and Sarah wondered if the line had gone dead, but then Jake's voice came back heavy with emotion. "Bravo! Are you serious? I thought I'd never hear anything about him again." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she listened to the emotion in Jake's voice. "He's been with me for a few years now," she said softly. "I had no idea about his past until recently. He saved my life in ways I can't even explain." Jake let out a shaky breath. "He saved mine, too, more times than I can count. I need to see him at that moment." Sarah knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for her, but for Bud, and the man who had once been his closest companion. The days following Sarah's call with Sergeant Jake Carter felt like an eternity. Jake had insisted on flying out as soon as possible to see Bravo. But as Sarah knew him now, though, she tried to focus on her daily routine. The anticipation of their meeting filled the air with a nervous energy. She wondered how Bud would react. Would he remember? Jake, would this reunion change the bond they shared? The questions churned in her mind as she prepared herself for the emotional day ahead on the afternoon of Jake's arrival. Sarah waited with Bud outside her small apartment. She could feel the leash trembling slightly in her hands as Bud shifted his weight, sensing her unease. "It's going to be okay, Bud," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was reassuring him or herself. Car pulled up and she heard the door slam. Jake's deep voice greeted her. Moments later, "Sarah," he called out, his tone laced with of excitement and apprehension. Sarah smiled nervously. "Yes, I'm Sarah, and this," she gestured toward Bud, her voice catching slightly. "This is Bravo," at the sound of his old name. Bud's ears perked up. Jake froze for a moment, his eyes locked on the dog. Slowly he crouched down and extended a hand. "Hey there, boy," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Do you remember me?" Bud stood still, his body tense. Sarah felt her breath hitch as the seconds stretched on, and then Bud took a cautious step forward, sniffing Jake's outstretched hand. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, but then it happened. Bud's tail began to wag, and he let out a low whine. Jake's eyes filled with tears as he reached out to gently stroke the dog's head. "You remember, don't you, Jake?" whispered. Sarah could hear the emotion in his voice, and she felt her own tears welling up. She had always known Bud was special, but seeing the connection between him and Jake brought a new depth to that understanding as the three of them moved inside. Jake shared stories of their time together in the military. "Bravo was my partner on every mission. He explained he saved my life more times than I can count. He was fearless, but I never thought I'd see him again." Sarah listened intently, her fingers brushing Bud's fur as Jake recounted their bond, though Jake's stories were filled with danger and sacrifice. Sarah could hear the love and respect he had for Bud in every word that evening. As Jake prepared to leave, he knelt beside Bud. "One last time, you've got a good life now, boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have asked for a better person to take care of you." Sarah felt her chest tighten at his words. "Thank you for trusting me with him," she said softly. Jake stood and gave her a small smile. "He's in the right place," as he walked away. Sarah looked down at Bud. "You've been through so much," she murmured. "But no matter what, you're home now after Jake's visit." Sarah couldn't stop thinking about everything she had learned about Bud, or Bravo, as Jake had called him, the stories of Bud's bravery in combat, his quick thinking under pressure, and his loyalty in the face of danger painted a picture of a dog who had lived through more than most humans could imagine it. Both awed and saddened her every time she touched his fur or felt him guide her across the street. She couldn't help but wonder how much of that loyalty came from the scars of his past. One afternoon, Sarah decided to take Bud to a quieter part of the park, a place she had avoided since the incident with Hank. The memory of that day still lingered, but now it felt different. She no longer saw Bud as just her guide dog. She saw him as a protector, a warrior who had chosen to give her his trust. As they walked along the path, she spoke to him softly. "I hope you know how much you mean to me, but you've done so much for so many people, and you still choose to be by my side every day." Bud responded with a gentle nudge against her leg, as if to say he understood. Sarah smiled and sat down on a bench, letting him rest at her feet. The park was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of peace, but her thoughts drifted back to something Jake had said during his visit. He doesn't forget his training. It's always there, just waiting. She wondered if Bud ever missed that life, the adrenaline, the danger, the constant purpose. Later that evening, Sarah decided to reach out to Jake again. She wanted to know more, not just about Bud's past, but about how to honor it. "Jake," she said over the phone, "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me. Do you think Bravo, ever misses his old life?" There was a pause on the other end before Jake replied. "He might in his own way, but dogs like him don't live in the past. They live for their people, and right now, Sarah, you're his mission." Those words stayed with her long after the call ended. You're his mission. Sarah had always seen Bud as her lifeline, the one who helped her navigate a world she couldn't see. But now, she realized that their bond was more than just dependence. It was mutual. She had given Bud a purpose, just as he had given her the confidence to live her life again. It was a partnership in every sense of the word that night. As Sarah sat on the floor beside Bud, she whispered, "I'll make sure you know how much you're loved. Bud, every single day." Bud leaned into her, his warm presence grounding her in the moment for Sarah. There was no greater comfort than knowing that no matter what challenge just lay ahead, they would face them together. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself settling into a deeper understanding of her bond with Bud, knowing his past didn't change their relationship. It enhanced it every time he guided her across the street or nudged her away from danger. She thought about the battles he had fought both in combat and in adapting to this new life. But one lingering thought kept her awake. At night, was she truly giving him the life he deserved one morning while sipping her coffee? Sarah came across an article about retired military dogs. It described how many canines struggled to adjust after leaving the field without the intense structure of their training. Some dogs became restless or depressed, longing for a sense of purpose. Sarah looked down at Bud, who lay peacefully at her feet. He didn't seem restless, but what if she was missing signs? The idea that Bud might be silently yearning for more tugged at her heart, determined to make sure Bud was truly happy. Sarah began researching ways to enrich his life. She learned about programs designed for retired service dogs, places where they could engage in activities that mirrored their old training. That afternoon, she called one of these organizations and explained Bud's story. The woman on the line was enthusiastic. "We'd love to evaluate Bud." She said these sessions aren't just about activity. They're about giving dogs a sense of fulfillment, and it sounds like he'd thrive here. The following week, Sarah and Bud arrived at the facility. It was a sprawling property with open fields, obstacle courses, and small groups of retired canines working alongside their handlers. Bud perked up as soon as they stepped through the gate, his ears forward and tail wagging slightly. Sarah could feel the excitement in his movements, and for the first time she wondered if this was what he'd been missing. A trainer approached, smiling warmly. "This must be Bravo," she said, kneeling to greet him. "Let's see what he remembers." As Bud was guided through a series of tasks, tracking agility and scent detection, Sarah watched from a bench nearby. Her chest tightened as she saw him come alive, moving with precision and confidence she hadn't seen before. It was as if a part of him that had been dormant was now fully awake. The trainer returned her face, glowing with admiration. "He's incredible," she said. "It's like he never left the field." Sarah nodded, her emotions a mix of pride and bittersweet realization. That evening, back at home, Sarah knelt beside Bud and stroked his fur. "You're amazing," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "I never want you to lose that part of yourself. Whatever you need, we'll figure it out together." Bud leaned into her touch, his steady presence reassuring her. For Sarah, the day had been a revelation. Bud wasn't just her guide. He was still Bravo, and his story was far from. Over the weeks following, Bud's evaluation at the training facility brought a new rhythm to Sarah's life. Every Saturday, they returned to the center where Bud participated in exercises designed for retired canines. It was clear that he thrived in this environment, tracking scents, navigating obstacle courses, and responding to commands with the precision of a dog still in his prime. Watching him move with purpose filled Sarah with pride, but it also deepened her understanding of who Bud truly was. One afternoon, after another successful session, the trainer pulled Sarah aside. "Bud's exceptional," she said. "He's not just a retired canine. He's one of the best I've ever seen. It's rare to see this level of focus and discipline in a dog who's been out of service for so long." Sarah smiled, though her heart felt heave. She knew Bud's work here gave him joy, but she also worried about balancing his needs with her own. "Do you think he's happy?" she asked hesitantly. The trainer's expression softened happiness. For dogs like him comes from having a purpose. And Sarah, you're part of that purpose. That evening, Sarah reflected on those words as she sat beside Bud in her small living room. He lay at her feet, his breathing steady, his presence as comforting as ever. She thought about everything he had given her over the years, his guidance, his protection, his unwavering loyalty. She had once believed she was the one who depended on him, but now she realized it went both ways. "You've never stopped being a hero, have you?" she whispered, stroking his fur. "Even now, you're still looking out for me." Not long after, Sarah received a call from Jake Carter. His warm voice greeted her, and they spent nearly an hour talking about Bud's progress. When Sarah told him about the training sessions, Jake chuckled. "That sounds like the Bravo I knew," he said. "But don't forget, his biggest mission is you. You're his family." Now his words stayed with Sarah long after the call ended. Bud's life might have changed, but his purpose remained the same, protecting those he cared about. One evening, while out for a walk, Sarah and Bud stopped at a familiar bench in the park. It was the same spot where their lives had shifted. Weeks ago, when Bud's past had first been revealed, as Sarah sat, she let the cool evening breeze wash over her. "You've been through so much," she said softly, her voice carrying gratitude. "But no matter where you've been or what you've done, you've chosen to stay by my side, and I'll never take that for granted." As if understanding her words, Bud leaned against her leg, his quiet strength